Hi, I'm Dr. Walter Matwichuk, and I'm going to give a presentation on transforming unhealthy anger into healthy anger from the REBT perspective. The goals of today's presentation is to delineate the thematic content of unhealthy and healthy anger, draw a distinction between unhealthy and healthy anger, and explain the REBT perspective on how unhealthy anger is created. I plan to specify the core attitudes at the heart of unhealthy anger, give an overview of how to address the core attitudes to transform unhealthy anger into healthy anger, and briefly discuss how healthy anger allows for healthy states of unconditional self, other, and life acceptance. Now, the thematic content of anger involves an inference. An inference is a thought, a private thought, a subjective thought that a person has. And in the case of unhealthy and healthy anger, the thematic content involves being obstructed, being blocked, or frustrated by someone or something, including yourself. So you can get angry at yourself, or you can get angry at being blocked if there's something or someone who's blocking you or stopping you from doing whatever it is that you'd like to do. Another thematic aspect of unhealthy anger is that we infer that one of our rules are being transgressed, that someone's treating us unfairly or criticizing us in an unfair way. But people have all sorts of rules. And then finally, anger can result when we make the inference that our self-esteem is being threatened, that we're being insulted or disrespected. Now, from the REBT perspective, there are two types of unhealthy anger. There's what we call ego-based anger, and then there's non-ego-based anger. And in both instances, the individual makes the inference that either they're being blocked or thwarted towards a goal, that one of their rules are being broken, or there's a threat to their self-esteem. But in the case of non-ego-based anger, the threat to the self-esteem is not present. So in the ego-based anger, the individual is at some level devaluing themselves, either because they're being thwarted and they can't circumvent being thwarted, or the actions of another person, the disrespect that's occurring leads the individual to devalue themselves, or they tend to devalue themselves because of the rule that's being broken. So in essence, they're essentially saying, I'm lesser of a person because, and then they talk to themselves about either being blocked or the disrespect that they're facing or the rule that's being broken. In non-ego-based anger, it is an anger that's unrelated to the self-esteem of the individual, and they essentially see themselves as being unable to bear the external conditions that they're facing. So in this case, it would be like, I can't bear being late for work or a meeting. I can't bear to miss a flight. So they're unable to tolerate the circumstances that they're in. They're being thwarted towards their goal, and they get angry because of this circumstance that they can't do much about. It's helpful to recognize when you're having either an ego-based anger or non-ego-based anger. Now, in the case of unhealthy anger, the inference is that we're being blocked and thwarted, but this inference that we're having is rooted in rigid and extreme attitudes. And these rigid and extreme attitudes then motivate us to act in self-defeating ways. We may display overt verbal or behavioral aggression. We may display passive-aggressive behavior, or we may displace our aggression. We may kick the dog or shoot the messenger due to our anger. In healthy anger, we make the inference that we're being blocked, that our rules are being broken, or self-esteem is being threatened. However, the underlying attitude that we're holding is flexible and non-extreme. The result of having a different attitude in the face of these inferences is that we are motivated to help ourselves deal with the block, the thwarting that we're facing, or even the threat to our self-esteem. So we'll engage in assertive behavior. We'll make very firm statements, but we're able to be assertive, not aggressive. And in the case of a physical attack, with healthy anger, our anger is self-protective and matches the assault that we're facing. So we don't exceed the threat. We just ward it off with our physical response. In unhealthy anger, you have a short-term oriented discharge of emotion. So you can act very self-defeatingly when under the influence of unhealthy anger. And that unhealthy anger often undermines our social harmony, our ability to deal with a conflict that we may be having with another person. And when we're under the influence of unhealthy anger, our subsequent thinking is biased. We may have a bias towards inferences of malicious intent or attribution of malicious intent. We may have a tunnel vision or a rumination that impairs our creative problem solving. So the important distinction is that healthy anger is not less unhealthy anger. It's actually a qualitatively different emotion. It has a long-term orientation and it's self-helping. Healthy anger is a poised anger. It enables us to deal with the problem and protect ourselves and proceed towards conflict resolution. And the inferences that are generated by this emotion tend to be more realistic. We have improved estimates of the probability of malicious intent versus non malicious intent, so that we have a more balanced view of the possibilities or attributions that we make about how things came about. We are able to include all the available data in our thinking, and it promotes creative problem solving. So from our point of view in REBT, a healthy anger is synonymous with a functional anger, an adaptive anger. And whereas an unhealthy anger is synonymous with a dysfunctional anger or a maladaptive anger. It's very self-defeating, unhealthy anger. Now, Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, taught that men are disturbed not by things, but by their views of them. And REBT starts with the premise that adversity in and of itself is insufficient to produce unhealthy anger. Implicit in this idea is personal responsibility for unhealthy anger. So here you see, excuse me, two models of emotion. And what we're trying to do is bring people from what I like to call the prisoner of circumstances model of emotion over to the self-empowering ABC model of emotion. And of course, Albert Ellis, the originator of REBT, is the person who created this framework, and he did it by being familiar with the work of the Stoic philosophers and all the other philosophers who talked about the impact our thinking has on our feelings. And he created this simple mnemonic device or framework for getting across the point that adversity in and of itself is insufficient for creating our unhealthy, angry response. Now, as you can see, what we're emphasizing here is that an inference isn't what is leading to our anger. It's the underlying basic attitudes that we hold about whatever it is that we're inferring is occurring. So let's define some of the terms in the ABC model. The ABC model starts with adversity, and we define adversity as a negative state of affairs, and we put that at point A. And that, in the case of anger, it's where we are facing the negative state of affairs of either being obstructed or blocked or frustrated, or making the inference that someone's transgressing our rules, or again, making the inference that someone is threatening our self-esteem. And this negative state of affairs can be in the past. So we can anger ourselves in the present about something in the past. When we think about what occurred in the past, we can anger ourselves in the present when we make the inference that someone is insulting us or attempting to insult us. And then we could even get angry about something we anticipate, news we hear that about something that could happen in the future. Now, we make a distinction between what we call the situational way and the critical way. So first, let me talk to you about the situational way. The situational way is an objective description of the negative state of affairs that we may be facing. The situational way would be the sights and sounds a camera would pick up, recording the events as they unfold. It's a factual description of the context that anger occurs in. So, for example, if someone were to spit in my face, they would see that individual doing so, and they might see the reaction I have to having that done, and they might see what I might say or what I might do in that context. So that's what the camera would pick up. What the camera would not pick up is the critical A. The critical A is a subjective, private thought that I have. It's an inference. So, for example, if someone were to spit in my face, one inference I could have is they've intentionally done that. On the other hand, with very similar circumstances, I might think to myself, well, they sneezed, and that's how all this sputum ended up on my face. So you have a critical A where there's an inference or an interpretation. And it's very important when you're using the ABC framework to identify the critical A that's buried within the situational A, because that inference is more or less the spark, if you will, in the processing of our anger. So we make an inference, and we might make an inference like this other person is insulting me in the worst possible way by spitting in my face. Or in the case of anger, a non-ego anger would include an inference like, I'm going to be late for a meeting, I'm going to miss my plane, or I'll be late for the start of a playoff game because of the traffic I'm encountering in going to the stadium. And what REBT is going to try to show you is that these hunches or private subjective thoughts, whether they are accurate or inaccurate, REBT is not going to challenge the veracity of these thoughts, or at least not initially, because we believe what's at the heart of anger, what's the primary driver of unhealthy anger, are deeper level, rigid, and extreme attitudes. And REBT is unique in the cognitive behavior therapies insofar as we're going to spend a great deal of time emphasizing the importance of these rigid and extreme attitudes that we believe are the primary drivers of unhealthy anger. So we're actually going to teach people that anger is not something that happens to you, but a healthier way of thinking about things is that we largely anger ourselves. We disturb ourselves. Yes, people may invite us to anger ourselves, but we upset ourselves. We can decline the invitation for anger, and we do this by adopting the principle of emotional responsibility and holding flexible, non-extreme attitudes about adversity. So this point of declining the invitation for anger is essential for anyone who's struggling with unhealthy anger. As long as you believe that someone triggers your anger, you're going to be at the mercy of circumstances. And I firmly believe that the alternative position, which is that people invite us to anger ourselves, but we accept that invitation and we more or less run with the ball by thinking about their actions in a rigid and extreme way, is a wonderful way for managing our anger, because when we take responsibility for our emotional response, we're now in the driver's seat to respond to another person's provocation. And believe me, someone has spit in my face, and I did decline the invitation to punch them because I thought that doing so would be imprudent in the long run. And therefore, I essentially left the situation, went home, cleaned myself up, and reflected upon how what I did was really the prudent thing to do, because when adults fight, they can get themselves badly injured. And it seemed to me that the best reason for any kind of physical response to another is only in the case of self-defense. Being spit in your face doesn't meet the threshold, I would argue, is necessary for engaging in any kind of physical reaction, other than to leave the situation where this disrespectful act occurs. Now, in REBT, we're going to argue that rigid attitudes can be directed at ourselves, other people, or life conditions. And Albert Ellis called these attitudes musts, but it's not the word must that we're targeting. We're targeting the deeper level rigidity that is reflected in the word must. So we can make ourselves angry by saying, you must treat me nicely, but I can make myself angry at myself by saying, I must perform perfectly well, or I must have certain personal characteristics. So again, both ideas I just expressed rigidity or intolerance, but what the first one did, you must treat me as I want you to treat me, the rigidity was directed at another person. Whereas when I said to myself, I have to perform perfectly well, or I should not have made that mistake, when I use those words, now this rigid, intolerant attitude, this dogmatic attitude is being directed at myself. And finally, we can direct our rigid attitudes at the conditions of life. We might think that life absolutely should be easy, or not too difficult, or it has to be easy, or it should be fair, or it has to be fair, or it must be fair. So it's not the word that we're targeting. We're targeting intolerance directed at ourselves, other people, or life itself. Now, what Ellis argued was that our rigid attitudes then gave birth or spawned secondary derivatives. And often these derivatives are expressed with words like, or phrases like, I can't bear it, I can't stand it, it's too much to take. So that's what we call an attitude of unbearability. In other instances, we might have an extreme rating of a situation that comes from one of our musts, where we might say, this missing a plane is awful, or turning up for an important meeting is awful. The consequences of being late and for a meeting are awful. And this will fan the flames of unhealthy anger. And then finally, and this is very common, where we will direct a rigid attitude at another person, and then we'll go beyond that and devalue them, and we might call them an effing jerk. So this other person absolutely has to treat me with respect, and if not, they're an effing jerk. So you see a global condemnation that goes well past what they did to what they are. They are a jerk. And what REBT is going to try to show people is that we can effectively rate what people do from our perspective. But when we begin to evaluate people as people, we're going a bit too far in an invalid way. Now, again, this is just giving expression to these three derivatives. It's unbearable, it's intolerable, it's too hard, it's awful, it's terrible, or the end of the world, or I am, you are, life is totally bad. And I often think of anger as the emotion of intolerance and condemnation. And it's just a question of what you're condemning, whether you're condemning yourself or other people or life itself. And so what we're going to do as an antidote to unhealthy anger is help people cultivate flexible attitudes that are directed at themselves, other people, and life conditions. And we're going to encourage them to also develop attitudes that aren't extreme, such as it's uncomfortable to face a particular set of circumstances, not unbearable, or not, it's not intolerable. It's bad when certain things happen. It's not awful. And that when we encounter misbehavior in another person, we objectively can say from our value system, their behavior is very bad, and hold them responsible for their behavior without condemning them as people. And the same thing with life. We can acknowledge that, and at times life is really tough, it's really rough, it's really frustrating. But we don't have to go beyond that and say, well, life is, totally bad. It totally stinks. And this will help us have a healthy emotional response to life itself. And so here you see, again, these flexible ideas. I want to have specific desirable characteristics and perform well, but I don't have to have them. I want other people to treat me nicely, but you don't have to have them. And I would like, or I wish that life conditions were easy and didn't produce undue difficulties, but it doesn't have to be that way. And again, just like with the rigidity, you can express your rigidity with different words like must, have to, absolutely should. You can express your flexible attitudes with different words like I would like, I hope, I want you to treat me nicely, but it doesn't mean you have to. So it's not the word, it's the flexibility. And again, we can have a strong preference for people to treat us nicely. So flexible doesn't mean flimsy. And when people don't treat us as we would like them to treat us, we can hold them accountable for their behavior. But what REBT is going to argue is that when you do this, you're going to you're going to hold them accountable, and you're going to do a better job of holding them accountable by having a healthy anger or a flexible attitude, leading to a more functional anger rather than an anger that destroys a relationship because there's this discharge of emotion that is unbridled, if you will. And the secondary derivatives are going to be put like this. It's hard to bear this adversity, but it's not unbearable. I could stand it. It's not too much to bear. It's a great deal to bear, but it's not too much to bear. Again, these ideas can be said in different ways, but notice that it's a non-extreme attitude, that it's more moderate. It's hard to bear, but it's not unbearable. It's bad. It's not awful. It's not beyond 100% bad. And we also might add that you did a bad thing. This proves that you're fallible. It doesn't prove that you're a rotten to the core jerk. We're not going to define people according to our arbitrary standards of what makes people saints and sinners. What we're going to do is we're just going to talk about their behavior, and we're going to acknowledge that people do bad things, and that is evidence that they're fallible humans. We all do bad things, and we're going to try to educate people that when we resort to arbitrary, invalid, and harmful definitions of what would define another person, that we're essentially doing more harm to ourselves because we're angering ourselves. So we try to encourage people to avoid arbitrary definitions of good people and bad people, even when many, many people may hold the same arbitrary definition. we're going to encourage people to stick with empiricism. And what you can empirically prove is a person did something bad. You really can't establish that a person is essentially bad, rotten to the core. And that's essentially what we're doing when we're under the influence of unhealthy anger, what I like to call the condemning emotion. Um, and what we're going to do is actively teach people to adopt flexible and tolerant, non extreme attitudes. We're going to teach them a process of doing self therapy. Now, what I like to say is that REBT is not only teaching certain ideas like humans are fallible and they can't be rated, but we're going to teach a self-therapy process. So we're not just giving fish dinners for the person who's suffering with unhealthy anger, if you will. We're teaching them to fish. We're going to teach them a method of self-correction that's going to serve them well. And what does that method of self therapy involve? It means first identifying the rigid and extreme attitudes that are at the core of our anger. We're going to encourage people to adopt the principle of emotional responsibility in the ABC model. And then we're going to teach them how to argue against the rigid and extreme attitudes that they've identified that is at the core of their emotional disturbance. And the different ways we're going to teach people to question their attitudes, to examine and argue against them, are going to include different lines of attack. So, for example, we're going to teach them to examine from a functional standpoint whether a particular attitude serves them well, all given all their goals and values. So, for example, when we anger ourselves and say people have to treat us fairly, that attitude very often, in fact, nearly always, leads to functional impairment in dealing with people. And we're going to try to help people see how a more flexible attitude that leads to assertive behavior is going to produce a higher functioning response, a functional response than the dysfunctional response that's produced by a rigid attitude. So the easiest line of attack for your unhealthy anger is to look at the functional impairment that your rigid and extreme attitudes cause you. Another line of attack that we're going to use and educate people to do is we're going to teach them to evaluate their rigid and extreme unhealthy anger producing attitude by examining whether they'd want to teach that same attitude to a child. Would you want to teach a child to think in the rigid way that you're thinking when you're experiencing the unhealthy anger that's wreaking havoc in your life? That's the question we're going to ask people to remember and ask themselves. And then we're going to ask people to, like a scientist, search for evidence that disconfirms their rigid, absolutistic attitude. And when you search for empirical evidence, you'll begin to see that there is no evidence that supports an absolutistic attitude. That what there is evidence that supports your desires. So, for example, if I think to myself, you absolutely have to treat me fairly, I'm not going to be able to come up with empirical evidence that's going to support that as being a truthful way of thinking. What I can come up with is lots of evidence why I want you to treat me fairly. And that doesn't constitute evidence that supports the idea that you therefore must treat me fairly. And so we're going to teach people to see that the evidence will help them stick with their preferences. I want you to treat me fairly, but I see you don't have to. There's no evidence that you have to. And then the last line, well, the next to last line is what we call identifying the illogic within your attitudes. Ellis argued that humans tend to think in non sequiturs, and that what we do is we go from our preferences or desires and we skip to demanding this. And so we'll go from saying, I want you to treat me nicely, which is perfectly healthy and your business to have that attitude, but you'll jump to Therefore, you have to treat me nicely. And it's that going from this flexible attitude to a rigid attitude, which constitutes a non sequitur. You need to go from a flexible attitude to a flexible attitude in order to remain in a logical series of thoughts. So, for example, if I said to you, I want you to treat me nicely. I like when you treat me nicely, but I acknowledge that you don't have to, that there's no law of the universe that says you have to, dictates that you have to, compels that you have to. I have now stayed in a logical sequence of thoughts. And finally, I didn't put it on the slides, but we often look at metaphors and fables and myths, particularly the Greek mythology that exists. There are plenty of myths that show the negative side of anger, the harmful aspects of anger. And if we know these myths or these metaphors or Aesop's fables, we can refer to them and teach them to you so that you remember how dangerous anger can be in your relations and in your functioning. So metaphorical disputes or disputation or metaphorical examination of our rigid and extreme attitudes also takes place, although I didn't include it on this slide. And what we're looking to do through this examination of our rigid and extreme attitudes is to create healthy alternative attitudes and teach people how to modify their thinking so that they create a healthy alternative attitude. And then, most importantly, we're going to teach them to rehearse that healthy attitude and live in harmony with it. And this is perhaps the most important part, because unless you engage in a healthy alternative behavior, you're really not going to develop deep conviction in its validity. You're not going to really see it work well and better than your unhealthy attitude. So living in harmony with this flexible attitude that you want people to treat you nicely, but they don't have to, is being assertive. That would be an example of living in harmony rather than getting in arguments with people and getting aggressive. Now, it takes some work to live in harmony with these healthy attitudes, but what we believe is that people can do this. We will train them in doing this. We'll train them in the behavioral alternatives that they have. And we start with saying, like, look, if you have a problem with anger, it's likely that you're well practiced at making yourself angry, and that therefore you need to have realistic expectations that it's not going to take you years and years and years to get over your unhealthy anger. But with REBT, you're going to have to practice identifying your unhealthy attitudes. You're going to have to practice examining them and challenging them. You're going to have to practice creating alternative attitudes that are going to lead to a healthier, more functional, adaptive anger, and that you're going to have to stay with it. But that you can learn to transform your rigid and extreme attitudes with repeated effort over time. Now, it all begins with this principle of emotional responsibility. You really have to get out of your head this idea, which is very popular, that other people trigger your anger. They invite you to anger yourself, and you can decline the invitation. No, thank you. I'm not going to anger myself. I'm done with that self-defeating response, and I'm going to respond to you in a different way. That's the spirit of the principle of emotional responsibility. And what we argue in REBT, whether you're doing it for anger or any other of the unhealthy negative emotion, that it's a lot like going to the gym to get physically fit. People go to the gym not with the expectation, hopefully, of going one time, but of and emerging physically fit. But we hope that people go to the gym with the expectation that physical fitness is something that you move towards through repetitive, ongoing visits to the gym. You repeatedly stress your body, rest, and stress it again. And you continue to do that. And then you maintain your fitness once you've developed it. Well, REBT is a lot like that. One REBT session with yourself or with a professional is not necessarily going to help you in a significant way. It'll give you some insight into how you anger yourself. But what you need to do is really learn the skill of doing this. And if you attend my weekly demonstrations on Zoom at 9 o'clock here in New York every Saturday, you'll see me work with people and train them how to think about their dysfunctional emotions and transform them into healthy emotions by thinking differently about the adversities they face. And every Saturday, I do this with a volunteer, and it's not always on anger. But what it does do is give people who have problems with different emotions a chance to sit back and watch this skill that we're teaching. Because again, we're teaching a self-therapy process. We're not just teaching rational thinking. And so it's just another way of training yourself by watching other people learn REBT. So just like fitness doesn't occur in one session, um, nor does 1 hour of REBT change you in a dramatic sort of way. We have to have realistic expectations about the change process, but it can occur, and it doesn't have to take years and years and years of analysis to do that. And particularly, the more time you spend working on your anger, the quicker you'll get at getting some degree of control over your unhealthy emotional responses. And then, of course, if you want enduring change, you're going to have to commit to, like the athlete who commits to going to the gym and engaging in regular physical fitness, you're going to have to commit to living in harmony with this new attitude and invoking this healthy negative response on a healthy anger response on an ongoing basis. REBT is really saying you need to commit to having a flexible and non-extreme attitude throughout your life if you're going to have optimal emotional control over your reactions to adversity. So ongoing regular self-therapy is what it's going to take to maintain the therapeutic changes that you'll make or learn in therapy. And what I'm going to argue is that anger really is a failure to accept reality as it is. It's a philosophy of intolerance and condemnation. And there's plenty of intolerance and condemnation on display on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or on YouTube. I think we live in a time where intolerance and condemnation are in ample supply, and REBT is an effort, is a therapeutic philosophy and effort to help people cultivate tolerance and not being condemning of people. I think that it is a way of learning tolerance, REBT is. And at the same time, we're encouraging people to see that tolerance is self-serving. When we tolerate reality as it is, we then can have a healthier, optimal response to changing what we can. So I think a healthy anger or a functional anger can coexist with unconditional self-acceptance, unconditional other acceptance, and unconditional other acceptance. And in order to understand how a healthier negative emotion can coexist with self-acceptance, other acceptance, and life acceptance, it's important that you understand that flexible attitudes make this possible. If you hold flexible attitudes like you want to do well, but you don't have to, then when you err, you're going to be more self-accepting and you're not going to experience unhealthy anger directed at yourself. If you hold the attitude, I want you to treat me nicely, respectfully, fairly, but you don't have to. And I see that the universe doesn't compel humans to treat me nicely, even though I want them to, or even though I may treat them nicely, then I'm going to have a healthy, functional, adaptive response, whether we call it a healthy anger, an adaptive anger, a functional anger, or we call it annoyance or whatever we call it. It's still qualitatively different. It's a more functional emotional response. We're not joyful, but we're not in this short-term oriented emotional response that or state that can get us into a great deal of trouble. And then finally, when we have unconditional life acceptance, it really is predicated on the idea that, look, life doesn't have to be the way we want it to be. And this is one of the major ideas of REBT, that no matter how badly we want something, whether it be about ourselves, others, or life, we never have to get it. We never have to have it. It doesn't mean we can't try to get what we want in life, but it's very important if you want to have a healthy emotional response to adversity in life to see that you do not have to get what you desire, and that the path to unconditional life acceptance or self acceptance or other acceptance is to acknowledge that a negative state of affairs exists, acknowledge that all the conditions are in place for that negative state of affairs to exist, to hold the preference that it would be better if this reality didn't exist, but to understand that it doesn't make logical sense to conclude that because you don't want reality to be a certain way, that it must not. To see that reality, when is dispreferred, is bad, but that there always can be a worse set of circumstances to face, and therefore it's not awful. That it's uncomfortable when we face a dispreferred reality, but it's not unbearable. And that our concept of acceptance differs from resignation insofar as we're resolving to change the existing conditions if they can be changed. So we're going to still try to think about the future, much like Nelson Mandela did, and work towards making things better, but with a healthy, fueled by a healthy negative emotion. And then finally, that our notion of acceptance involves adjusting constructively and moving on if we can change reality. So REBT really sees emotional health as having the capacity to find alternative paths to happiness when the preferred path is blocked. And you see, when our preferred path is blocked, it's human nature to then get angry and try to force change. But what we're trying to do is teach people how to pivot and find alternative paths to happiness when the one that they most want is blocked, and they still can try to get what they want, but we're going to try to teach them not to demand that they get what they want. And that really is the main message of REBT, that demandingness leads to self-defeating anger. So I'd like to conclude today's presentation by saying that every Saturday, and I've done it now for many, many, many weeks over the past several years, at 9 a.m. Here in New York, I do a weekly demonstration that's available to anyone around the world who's up and wants to attend. You can leave your camera off and you can lay in bed and have a cup of coffee if you are in the part of the world where 9 a.m. in New York is very early. Or if it's late night, wherever you are, if you're in the further east of where I am, then it'll be late at 9 a.m. in New York. And you can keep your camera off and lay in bed and almost watch it like a TV show. And so if you write to me at rebtdoctor@gmail.com, you can request a link, or you can go to my website, rebtdoctor.com, and there you'll find a place where you can put in your email address and it'll come to me And what you'll get is two things. You'll not only get the link to my weekly demonstration, which is an hour-long demonstration, 40 minutes or 45 minutes of it is a demonstration. And then the last 15 minutes, I take questions from the audience that's watching. So it's not a role play, it's a real demonstration of how a conversation of how these ideas come together to help a person with their unhealthy negative emotions. But I also send out once a week, usually, or once every other week, what I call the intermittent reinforcement email message. This message is not at all um, salesy. It is really a content email message that aims to remind you to think in a healthy way and teaches you to think in a healthy way. And if you go to my website, rebtdoctor.com, you'll see that there are free audios and videos and other types of learning materials. So the idea is that REBT is a psychoeducational approach, and these powerful ideas, which I believe can really make a significant difference in a person's life, um, it can be taught, and they can be taught through several different means. They can be taught through the individual consultations people have with me, but they can also be taught through books or through videos or through presentations like this one. So I think that REBT is a really solid system of ideas. It's essentially logical thinking, scientific thinking applied to human relations and human dilemmas and human problems. It's something that probably should be taught in the schools, preferably should be taught in the schools, but isn't. And therefore, we have to get it out there some other way, because God knows that the world has plenty of anger right now that's unhealthy, and plenty of intolerance and plenty of condemnation. And I think it would be a better place if more people knew about REBT. So thank you for your attention. And I hope that you'll go back and watch this video and watch some of my other videos so that you can learn REBT to enrich your life. That's it for this presentation, and take care.